Islamic Law and International Law Symposium. Today, we are very, very happy to be joined by Dr. Ahmed Al Dawoody, who is the legal advisor for Islamic law and jurisprudence at the International Committee for the Red Cross. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
So I just wanted to start off by asking if you could explain for our viewers why it is important to look at Islamic law as it relates to war and why it has a key role to play in perhaps facilitating or supplementing a broader respect for what is sometimes considered to be a very Eurocentric law on the use of force in IHL.
Thank you so much, Ayesha, for the invite and for this important question. As we all know, Islamic law is one of the oldest legal systems in existence and one of the three major legal systems in the world today. And according to some recent studies, there are 29 Muslim majority states that include compulsory implementation of family, civil, commercial, or criminal Islamic laws in their legal systems.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, many people feel more bound to and are more inclined to follow their own religious and indigenous traditions. And Islamic law is indeed a prime example. Islamic law, just in case for our wider audience, is being used by hundreds of millions of Muslims to determine, for example, one, how do they eat? Two, how their finance is complied with sharia. Three, where they spend their zakah. Four, how they determine what human rights to accept and what to reject. Six, how they make peace. And more importantly, for the concern of our discussion today is seven, how they conduct hostilities. So an Islamic law has developed rules regulating warfare, and since a significant percentage of armed conflicts are taking place now in Muslim contexts, and many non-state parties to armed conflicts use Islamic law as their source of reference, we cannot afford to overlook the impact Islamic law may have in influencing behavior in armed conflict and alleviating human suffering. Also, research shows that an exclusive focus on the law is not as effective in influencing behavior in armed conflict as a combination of the law and the values underpinning it. So, linking the limits set out in international humanitarian law, IHL, to local norms and values, whether it is Islamic or any other local traditions, gives them greater traction and peers the possibility of obtaining restraint. Accordingly, over the decades, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, has studied the interplay between IHL and other cultures, religions, and legal systems, such as the traditional Somali behavior in war, wars of dignity in the Pacific, and more recently, African traditional customs. Also in Asia, more recently, the ICRC has focused on investigating how Buddhism as well as Hindu ethics of war might also help to reduce suffering during armed conflict. So it is imperative that we recognize the significance of the rich body of Islamic law and engage with it to enhance respect for IHL and alleviate the suffering of victims of armed conflict in relevant Muslim contexts. I should add that some other international organizations have undertaken projects or training related to Islamic law or shown interest in understanding the impact of Islamic law on their work, such as Geneva Call, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNHCR, and more recently, the International Criminal Court. Although the international society's recent engagement on Islamic law is important and also far-sighted, I emphasize that it has not been taken seriously enough yet, despite its influence in public life. Finally, and yes, you are right, IHL is considered in some parts of the world a Eurocentric law. However, many cultures and civilizations did develop rules regulating the use of force in armed conflict, and therefore IHL principles are not foreign to the
Right.
Islamic, Chinese, Indian, and African civilizations, of course, among many others. And IHL is an embryonic field of public international law, but the similarities in the principles underpinning IHL and many warfare traditions show that IHL is truly international. Now, IHL is the universally accepted legal regime for alleviating the suffering of victims of armed conflict. Hence, the universality of IHL can be reinforced by explaining that its humanitarian principles are universally intuitive.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I also wanted to go into the fact that you mentioned in your book that European scholars have mostly looked at the jus ad bellum in Islamic law because they have anxieties about the notion of jihad, and so they haven't really looked that much at the Islamic jus ad bellum. Do you think that that is still true? And could you explain briefly the Islamic law in both of these areas of law, the law relating to the use of force as well as IHL?
Briefly, first I should mention that classical Muslim jurists uh, paid the greatest part of their attention to the Islamic jus in bello, the rules regulating the conduct of war, while paying little attention to the Islamic jus ad bellum, the justification for restoring to war. That is uh, basically because they wanted to regulate the conduct of Muslims during hostilities. Like the other areas of Islamic law, they exerted a great effort to delineate what is halal, what is allowed, and what is haram, what is prohibited during armed conflict. And the main objectives of the Islamic law of armed conflict are first, not to endanger the lives of civilians and non-combatants, and second, not to destroy the property of the enemy unless dictated by military necessity. And for more than a century now, Muslim scholars shifted the focus of the Islamic jus ad bellum, partly because they have engaged in responses to misunderstandings of jihad. For Western scholars, yes, they have focused on the Islamic jus ad bellum because first, they wanted to explain the nature of jihad and the reasons for the spread of Islam and the expansion of the Islamic State, particularly during the first century of the history of Islam. Second, many technical difficulties uh, confront Western researchers on Islamic law because this area is linked to other Islamic disciplines such as Islamic history, Arabic language, Quranic and Hadith studies. Third, the lack of adequate works in European languages on the Islamic jus in bello adds to the difficulties in this area. But I argue that the examination of each of these areas of law contribute to the understanding of the other. And hopefully our focus in the rest of our discussion today will be useful in this regard.
Yeah, yeah. And I wanted to then ask you if you could just explain for us some of the key aspects of the similarity between Islamic law and IHL, the laws of war?
Okay. Again, very briefly as well, uh, Islamic law, yes, did develop detailed rules to regulate the use of force during conflict. And it is quite remarkable that Muslim jurists of the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, in fact, were already discussing, negotiating, and developing rules to regulate the way Muslims conduct hostilities during armed conflict, with the same objectives as IHL today of alleviating the suffering of victims of conflict and protecting certain persons and objects. For example, as can be seen from this discussion, classical Muslim jurists developed a number of principles that we can find in Islamic law books. For example, one, the protection of civilians and other non-combatants. Two, the prohibition of certain indiscriminate weapons,
Right.
certain primitive weapons that they used at this time. Three, prohibitions of certain methods of war that may lead to indiscriminate killing of civilians and non-combatants. Four, protection of property. Five, prohibition of mutilation. Six, humane treatment of prisoners of war. Seven, aman, or what is translated into English as safe conduct and quarter. And eight, human dignity. And these principles of Islamic law regulating the use of force in armed conflict demonstrate that the legal literature produced by classical Muslim jurists aimed at limiting the effects of armed conflict. Therefore, the similarities in the principles underpinning IHL and Islamic law of war suggest that these two legal traditions have the same objectives.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you could give some examples of prohibited actions in warfare under Islamic law, but I think you've already mentioned quite a few, including mutilation and some prohibitions on indiscriminate weapons. But if there's any others that you'd like to add.
Sure. Let me conclude this question by taking quickly the discussion from the theory now to making an impact on the ground. And I would stress that alleviating human suffering and addressing the serious humanitarian consequences of armed conflict necessitates a multidisciplinary approach where both research and humanitarian action are mutually informed by each other. And the complex and evolving nature of armed conflict requires that research should be focused on field realities, on contemporary challenges facing IHL, and humanitarian action and policy should be guided by multidisciplinary research and expertise. Also, formal and informal norms specific to particular groups or armed or contexts that might influence the behavior of arms carriers to respect IHL should be invoked. This obliges humanitarian actors to dig deeper into their understanding of the local particularities and find ways to universalize IHL principles. Now, coming to your question about examples of the Islamic prohibitions, let me also speak now about focus on 6 prohibitions. And we will see that these prohibited acts in warfare indicate again that the major objective is the protection of civilian persons and objects and alleviating the suffering of victims of armed conflict, while ensuring that these prohibitions will not lead to the defeat of the Muslim army. In other words, we will see during the brief discussion of these 7 prohibitions that there is a balance between humanity
Right.
and military necessity.
Yeah.
Number one, deliberate harm of civilians and non-combatants. Islamic law, as we all know, makes it clear that all fighting on the battlefield must be directed solely against enemy combatants, and civilians and other non-combatants must not be deliberately harmed during the course of hostilities. And verse number 190 in chapter 2 in the Quran reads, quote, "And fight in the way of God those who fight against you and do not transgress," unquote. So Muslims are permitted to engage in hostilities only against enemy belligerents. Otherwise, it's a violation of this Quranic injunction. And based on this text and also several hadiths attributed to Prophet Muhammad, in which women, the children, the aged, the clergy, and the usafa, an Arabic word means those who are hired by the enemy to do supporting services in the battlefield but do not engage in the fighting. All these mentioned in early Islamic law books as examples of protected categories that cannot be targeted during hostilities.
Right.
And of course, examples of other categories of civilians are given in early Islamic law books, such as farmers, traders, craftsmen, the blind, those who have physical or mental disabilities, etc. So it is needless to say here that members of these categories will lose their protection from attack if they take part in hostilities. And interestingly, medieval Muslim jurists also deliberated cases of indirect participation in hostilities.
Okay.
Yeah, and we usually find disagreements between those who adhere to the textual prohibitions and those who lifted these prohibitions because soldiers have to defend themselves in such cases. Still, some jurists would prefer not to target civilians in such cases of indirect participation in hostilities if they could capture them. So, and then number two, uh, prohibition of destruction of property and the natural environment. And in Islamic worldview, everything in this universe is the creation of God, and human beings are entrusted with the duty of protecting it and contributing to the development of human civilization. Hence, as a rule, attacks against enemy property and the natural environment, whether during peacetime or during armed conflict, which is not required by imperative military necessity, is prohibited.
Mm.
And in fact, the Syrian jurist Al-Awza'i, who died in the 8th century, argued that takhrib, an Arabic word which could be translated here as deliberate excessive destruction of enemy property during the course of hostilities, falls under the criminal act described in the Quran as fasad fi al-ard, literally
Okay.
translated as destruction or
Yeah.
mischief in the land. And by the way, this is the same description used for the crime of terrorism under Islamic law. So this rule generally applies to what the Muslim jurists called animate and inanimate property alike. Nonetheless, targeting horses and similar animals during the course of hostilities was permitted only if the enemy soldiers were mounting on them while fighting.
All right.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and the Prophet Muhammad also prohibited cutting down trees, except those that block the Muslims from engaging in the fighting, and prohibited also the destruction of housing. And following the same logic, the first Caliph Abu Bakr gave the well-known 10 instruction to his army commander Yazid ibn Sufyan, which includes, quote, do not cut fruit-bearing trees or destroy buildings, do not slaughter a sheep or a camel except for food, do not burn or drawn palm trees, do not loot, and do not be cowardly, unquote. Furthermore, from even a pure utilitarian perspective, Muslim medieval Islamic state practice would not normally resorted to wanton destruction of enemy property because of the customary practice at that time for enemy positions to be seized as war booty.
Yeah.
And the deliberations of the pre-modern Muslim jurists that we find in Islamic law books indicate that when required by military necessity, damage to enemy property may only be carried out with the aim of forcing the enemy to surrender and putting an end to the fighting. In other words, Muslim soldiers must not deliberately cause the destruction of enemy property for the sake of it. Number 3, inhumane treatment of prisoners of war. And we find that most of the rules under Islamic law that concern the prisoners of war are based on the treatment of the 70 enemy combatants captured during the Battle of Badr in the second year of the Islamic calendar, which is March 624. As for the treatment of prisoners of war during captivity, following, of course, the precedents set by the Prophet Muhammad and his instructions, observe good treatment towards the prisoners. استوصوا بالأسارى خيرا. Islamic law guarantees that prisoners of war shall be treated humanely and with respect. They must be fed and given water to drink, clothed if necessary, and protected from the heat and the cold and from cruel treatment. Their families, which include, according to Muslim jurists, parents and grandparents and children would remain, and grandchildren as well, would remain with them so as to protect the family unity. And torturing prisoners of war to obtain military information is prohibited. Forced mutilation, I just referred to it earlier, and there is also hadiths from the Prophet Muhammad in which he instructs Muslim soldiers, quote, do not loot, do not be treacherous, and do not mutilate. 5, prohibition of looting, also mentioned in this hadith, refers to a Muslim soldier takes or steals an item from the war booty before it is divided up or collected as part of the booty to themselves without handing it over to be distributed by the army chief. 6, and finally, prohibition of perfidy and the prohibition of ghadr, perfidy, or treachery obliges Muslims to respect their contracts and agreements. However, ruses are not prohibited in war under Islamic law. And in fact, the Prophet Muhammad says, war is a ruse.
Okay.
So, yeah, so finally, these prohibitions again show that there are limits set out under the Islamic law of armed conflict that can help reduce suffering during armed conflict and reduce respect for IHL in Muslim contexts.
Right, yeah. And I also wanted to ask, because you've done a lot of work on the specific instance of children in an armed conflict, if you could talk to me a little bit about how Islamic law and also how the laws of war protect children.
Yeah, thanks also for this important question. Uh, in recognition of the vulnerability of children and their role as the future of society, Islamic law also sets rules that protects the rights of children. In the event of armed conflict, both IHL and Islamic law provide general protection for civilians not taking part in hostilities, including including children. And because of the particular vulnerability of children, both IHL and Islamic law lay down a series of rules according children special protection in armed conflict. Both IHL and Islamic law identify children as a category of person who are placed at particular risk in situations of armed conflict, and therefore children are entitled to specific respect and protection in addition to the more general rules that apply to all persons in armed conflict. This specific respect and protection includes, for example, separation from adults while deprived of liberty, as mentioned in the hadith before, unless they are with members of the same family. Also, access of education, the reunification of unaccompanied children with their families.
And can you explain the rationale for engaging both IHL and Islamic law to protect children in armed conflicts taking place in a Muslim context?
Yes. Children, as we see from statistics, shoulder a disproportionate human cost of armed conflicts taking place today. Many of these conflicts have devastating effects on many Muslim communities across the globe. And according to reports published by Save the Children last June, and I quote, 468 million, or more than 1 in 6 children worldwide, live in areas affected by armed conflict. Africa remained the region that the highest total of children living in conflict zone, around 183 million. So the numbers, of course, speaks for themselves here. So in armed conflict, children are vulnerable to a wide range of risks that deprive them of the opportunity to fully experience their childhood. They are often get separated from their families, they detained, recruited, forcibly driven from their homes, killed, injured, denied access to education, and sexually abused. And to reduce this harm, the law protecting children in war needs context-specific solutions to counter inadequate implementation. So right now, most of armed conflicts are taking place in Muslim context, and therefore it is unrealistic to ignore the role Islamic law plays or can play in influencing behavior of weapon bearers, and here protecting children, of course. So Islamic law is being used at the moment as a source of reference, as I mentioned in the beginning, for certain Muslim non-state armed groups. Therefore, it is necessary to engage with Islamic institutions, scholars, experts in Islamic law and jurisprudence, and Islamic weapon bearers to adopt innovative and context-specific solutions to protect the children in armed conflict.
So finally, the last question for you is, can you explain how engaging in IHL and Islamic law can help strengthen respect for IHL in a Muslim context?
Thank you for for this question. Um, Engaging in IHL and Islamic law is a principled yet pragmatic approach, as I
Right.
have tried to show
Yeah.
also in answering some of the previous questions. IHL norms are not, unfortunately, are not popularly known. And so the discussion of IHL's protective framework alongside the Islamic law provisions is an excellent way of popularizing IHL in Muslim contexts. Identifying complementarities between the two frameworks, IHL and Islamic law, will help strengthen within theirs adherence to protective norms. At the same time, identifying areas of divergence between IHL and Islamic law is also useful because understanding how Islamic law and IHL rules differ and awareness of cultural and traditional norms present in Muslim contexts are essential for improved communication and informed decision-making in complex humanitarian contexts. To strengthen respect for IHL in Muslim contexts, there must be a continuous dialogue with the relevant stakeholders to address contemporary and changing challenges and integrate local preventive and protective traditions. And this dialogue will promote adherence to IHL and armed conflicts because its principles will be seen not, as you mentioned above the first question, as IHL being Eurocentric,
Yeah.
but as globally owned, and that IHL is the most comprehensive and up-to-date legal regime for humanizing contemporary armed conflicts.
Yeah, and I think the most important part of that for me was the principled yet pragmatic approach to incorporating and using both of these fields of law. Thank you so much for taking out the time to talk to us today. This was such an enlightening discussion.
Thank you so much for this interesting discussion and for your very thought-provoking questions. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for watching at home.